without stopping and talking through history a little bit, and I'll see how much time I have at the end. I think that will be beneficial. So my course is called Contra Dance and Community, and the community component is probably the most important and prevalent part to the semester, as I discovered the more I looked into this form, and you'll understand what I mean as I sort of outline it here. So I'm going to read my class description. What makes a community? What can a shared physical activity reveal about a group and the individuals within the group? Contra Dance and Community is a course open to all undergraduates with no previous dance experience required. The class meets twice a week, once in the classroom and once in the dance studio, and will explore the history of contra dancing in America and bring us to current trends from multiple perspectives. Weekly readings will be discussed and films shown. Time in the studio learning basic contra steps and patterns, as well as reconstructing historical dances, will lead to an expansive physical understanding of the form and a final contra dance designing group project. Guest teachers, callers, and musicians will be invited throughout the semester to provide a variety of expertise. A field trip to a contra dance off campus will be included. In addition to writing assignments, students will keep a journal of their studio experiences to be handed in at the middle and the end of the semester. And then I have two required texts. One of them is this little book called Heritage Dances of Early America by a man named Ralph Page, who was sort of a seminal writer and caller and choreographer in the 30s and 40s of American contra dancing. And the cool thing about this book, apart from it being little, and you can sort of, kind of feel like you can get through it, is that each dance that he described, there's a little history, but then he describes a dance as it was written about in the 1800s, and then he does a more current description of it. And so you'll see in the syllabus that we actually will try to reconstruct some of these dances from really like minimal writing to sort of see, as the students start to understand the vocabulary and the construct of the dance, how they could like put together an old one, which is sort of interesting. So that's that one. And then the other thing I found, because I was confounded by the lack of writing about this form in a contemporary analytical or theoretical from those perspectives. And there were little chapters about contra dancing in lots of books, or there were massive books about politics and country dancing, which is a whole other thing, which I won't go into now. But I did, at sort of in the 11th hour, found a book that was out of print, but then I Googled it, and it popped up. Like, I didn't find it in any other search. I saw the name of it, but couldn't find the book, and then finally I found it downloaded, like a 200-page book that a woman wrote in the late 1990s, called Contra Dance Choreography, A Reflection of Social Change. And I then reinserted chapters from that book throughout my whole syllabus. So it's become sort of a text for the class. All right, so I'll go through the weekly class outline. Every week we'll have a session in the studio first, and then a classroom session. So we right away go into what I call the ABCs of Contra Dance, basic steps. There's a lot of great YouTube videos that sort of do demonstrate that. I feel like I could probably even teach it, even though I haven't really been practicing. Initially, you learn things in a circle. You learn all the various coupling and partnering, and you learn the glossary of terms. And then you put it into these lines. The beautiful thing about this dance, to me, aesthetically, is that even though you're in couples, you end up dancing with everybody at some point. And through the course of a night of contra dancing, you essentially could dance with everybody in the room at some point. It's sort of designed that way. So week one, studio, ABCs of contra dance, and we'll start preparing and keeping a glossary in a journal that's going to be kept. And in the classroom, I'm going to ask them for a short in-class writing that they'll hand in. What is your definition of community? Based on the description of this course, how do you imagine a correlation between community and dancing? And briefly describe your and your family's dance experience in a community setting. So that's just a short writing to get a baseline. And then we'll watch a video that's a short, little award-winning documentary called Together in Time that kind of gives them a first visual. They will have danced a little first, and then they'll see people doing it. Week two, we continue on in the studio learning more contra dance material. And in the classroom, I'll explain what I'm expecting from the journal writing, which is really studio experience. I want how did this feel? Eventually, I think they'll start to say, how do they feel with each other? comfort levels and various things. So I'll talk about the journal writing. Then the first reading is by this man, Ralph Page, and it's a chapter in a bigger book, and it's just kind of the bread and butter, what is contra dance? It's a short chapter. And then I have the introduction of this bigger, more recent contra dance choreography, which is also an introduction, which starts to infuse some history, and we'll discuss the historical lineage of contra dance, which is in that little bit of a documentary too. So we're starting to see 1800s English country dance moving to America and to France and other places, why it becomes a dance in rural settings, when it's a social dance, when it's something that breaks away from other imposed social dancing and becomes something that gets pocketed off in different parts of America. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Week 4, more studio time, more ABCs of contra dance. I think we're just building on repertoire and starting to really experience dancing full blown at this point. Like we know enough stuff that we can just coordinate and start doing different sequential things. Classroom that week is a reading that I thought this was going to be my major reading, this like not very long article. I gave my readers this one, a one called Performance Transformation in Community, because it was a kind of pithy article but not very long that covers history, politics, society, performance, the aesthetic experience, kind of, and then has some interviewee kind of material from people within the community now and what they think. So that we read at week 4, even, and it will, as in Roseanne's way of, you start to read readings and you think, I've read this before. I'm kind of going with that idea that it reinforces some understanding of history as well as other things. And then another chapter from this bigger book called The Contra Dance Event. And starting to look at the event itself as a unit of analyzing the form, social interaction, being creative, the transmission of tradition in the context of performing, but also the structure and setting for your individual role in the community. So we're looking at the event itself. And then students will have to hand in something. They'll prepare 3 substantive questions to be asked in a subsequent interview of a guest caller, someone who actually calls at contra dances. So week 4, that contra dance guest caller will come to the dance class, and we'll have all of a sudden someone who really does it for real, who's not me or somebody else teaching the movement part. And then in the classroom that week, we'll interview that person based on the studio experience, and also a lot of these readings have interview components in them, so I thought that was actually became something that maybe the students would want to learn how to do. Like how do you ask a question and get an answer that you want? Week 5, we're back in the studio again, and then we start reconstructing a little bit. We have enough information, we have enough of a foundation of how to dance in this form, and so we start, let's open the book. Who wants to do, pick one you want to do. And there's also great pictures, and I'll show you pictures, and there's music for each one. There's, so we're thinking of it in an old historical way a little bit while we're constructing this. We're not being hip and contemporary with it. We're sort of going back in time. So yes, that's the, where was I? Guest caller, teacher. Yeah, so week 5, thank you. We start reconstructing there. And in that classroom that week, I shift into, there's an article called American Country Dancing, a Religious Experience, which is from a popular culture journal. And it talks about flow and the psychological aspects of going, not into a trance, but what is it that makes that experience physically meaningful, emotionally meaningful, psychologically meaningful. So that's an interesting article. And then to pair with that, and yet another chapter from that bigger book, which talks about the aesthetic of contra dancing, which also addresses ideas of flow, but more from an aesthetic kind of approach, like what's a flowy dance versus a, something that doesn't, and how do you, and I write, students will discuss the psychological concept of flow, as well as other states that dancing or physical activity can induce. How do we perceive the contra dance experience as a participant, and how does it make us feel, physically feel? So week 6, we're reconstructing some more in the studio. And at that point, I thought, just to kind of dovetail with this, I thought it would be fun to look at some literature from that period. So we read a chapter from Pride and Prejudice. where Elizabeth and Darcy, I don't know if you know, you've seen the movie, I reckon.
Yeah.
So they dance, but they talk through this whole scene.
Yes.
And in the book, it's not as we show. I have the clip also. Elizabeth and Darcy's dance from the BBC production of Pride and Prejudice, not from the one with Keira. No, it's another one which I prefer. And because it's a long miniseries, it takes much longer to get the story through. So we read that chapter, which describes the dance in a very minimal form, but kind of gives you a sense of the social mores and what people actually did when they were going to these dances, and how these dances fit into their life. And I have some selections from something called A Guide to Politeness, or a System of Directions for the Acquirement of Ease, Propriety, and Elegance of Manners.
Yeah.
Written in 1810. So some little bits, just to kind of, it's not a long reading, but just to give them a little idea of like what were you doing with your gloves on and everything. And then to really counter that, I have a reading called, it's a contemporary reading, 2006, called Contra and Contradiction, Gender and Agency Within a Social Dance Community. And this was also an 11th hour Google search find, but I did not. It's a thesis, and it's pretty interesting, and like kind of takes us from Pride and Prejudice, like bullseye, right into talking about essentialism and binary gender systems. And because contra dance is traditionally seems a binary form. You have a male and a female, or in the nomenclature, a lady and a gent. And over many periods, then there's, what if only women show up that night? Who does the gent role? There used to be a basket of neckties, so someone put a tie on. Then men started wearing skirts, and a lot of really interesting things have happened over a period of time. And this sort of discusses. There's even gender role free. How am I doing? I don't know what just came up. Oh, 15. Thank you. And so this is, I'm not quite sure if this entire article, I would have to really know who my population was and how it might be too big a leap from reading Pride and Prejudice to going into really specific contemporary gender issues, but it's really well written and interesting. So I thought that might be too much for one class, I feel, but I kind of like the idea of packing those things together. Let's look at male-female dynamics in the 1800s, and let's talk about how people are really dancing at these events, and not just what kind of people, but what's expected of you in terms of personal power, things like this. It's pretty interesting. I could talk about that one for a while, but I won't. And then their first, so students will discuss social behavior in the 1800s and contemporary gender roles in contra dance. And their first journal entries are due. I thought it would be interesting to collect the journals midway and then be able to comment on maybe what I thought they could embellish, and then collect them again at the end of the semester. Week 7, we're back in the studio with a contra dance guest caller and a guest musician. So my hopes is that we just kind of keep building on the live experience. Maybe we have recorded music at the beginning of the semester, and eventually get a fiddler or someone in. I don't know any of these people, and I didn't go out and meet them and hire them or anything. But that would be my goal, is just to buff up the bigger experience. In the classroom, students will listen to, this is sort of a music week, listen to and discuss old-time and contemporary contra dance music, and I list a bunch of selections of contemporary bands and musicians that are playing music at these events. Then they'll read A Case for Contra New England's Grand Dance Tradition, which is from a music journal. Talks about the musician's perspective, and another chapter about musicians and the beginning of composing contra dances, choreographing them to different kinds of music. And then we look at a couple of YouTube videos with there's like a techno contra dance, and there's really old-timey fiddly music, and and a lot of things in between, so that they'll start to understand the range that they could be, this form could be performed to. And then I will designate